2, 1.
I'm so glad to be here today with Marge Armston Dimmitt. Marge has a very special place in my life because for me she's a direct link to my grandmother, Myrtle Scherer Betts. When Marge was a young lady, she met my mother at school.
A little girl. In the second grade.
Met Marion in second grade at Dunedin Elementary School.
Correct.
Tell me about that. What happened?
Well, I think it was meant to be, for sure, because we became and have been lifelong friends, beginning in the second grade. In Dunedin Grammar School, and it was in, I think the building is still standing, the little 4-room schoolhouse, the traditional little brick schoolhouse, 1, 2, 3, 4 grades. We met in the second grade. And we formed a little club. Of course, children live in imagination, and certainly we did. And we formed a little club. We called ourselves the Tumberset Twins. And I don't know where we came up with that thought or that name or the reason we chose particularly Tumberset, but we did, and that's what we were for all through the grammar school and beyond years. And of course, a great memory, because we would have little meetings, and we had a little fort where Marion lived on Lockley Street in Dunedin. The fort was actually underneath the sort of a work table in back of their garage, and that was our fort. And we would sit in there and have regular meetings, and the Tumberset Twins had regular meetings, and we discussed business of sorts like what we might plant that day, or what we might eat that day, or what we might fix for lunch, or have our mothers fix for lunch to take to school. Those sorts of things are the things that we discussed, and took it all quite seriously.
That's amazing. I don't think I have anything similar in my own life, so it's very charming to me to hear about these little girls growing up in Dunedin and making your own club. Now, what were some of the activities of the club besides those meetings? I understand you met at each other's homes on a regular basis.
We did. We had Monday and Tuesday afternoons usually together after school, which our mothers allowed. Sometimes we could also get together on a Saturday. We did such things as go to movies in those years. It was a big entertainment, and we all thought, of movies as something to do as entertainment. The movies were very good in those years, too. Always had a happy ending. It was pretty nice. And so at any rate, but we would have our little club meetings, and that was important to us. We also made little altars on our dressers when we were home on our own, and we would dream up a little story to share with each other when we were together, either on the Monday or the Tuesday or the weekend on a Saturday, and tell the little story that we had developed in a little altar on our dresser with little figurines that we had, or shells, or something that we might collect that had some kind of meaning for our story that we were going to tell.
Well, both Marge and Marion are people with artistic talent. I can vouch for that because I've seen Marge's paintings and artwork, and my own mother has done sketches, Marion, and so it seems to me you were both little girls who were really using your imagination early on. What I'd love to have you tell us about is how it was that you first got to go and stay at Caladesi Island and what that was like.
Well, that was incredible. I heard about the island, and Mrs. Betts, my friend's mother, Mrs. Myrtle Betts, was legendary in her own time, and that's for sure, and has remained legendary. She would row us across the bay to the island, but I only heard about the island in the early friendship. Early on in the second grade, they would talk about the island. And I thought it sounded like Paradise Island somewhere in the remote South Seas or something. Well, there it was just across our bay, and I finally got to go to the island. And Mrs. Betts rowed us across. It was a 3-mile row. She was very strong, and it took maybe an hour to get across the bay, but we would go on a calm day. My mother's and father's friends used to say, "You mean to say that your mother and dad will allow you to go across the bay in the rowboat with Mrs. Betts?" And I said, if I weren't safe with Mrs. Betts, I would not be safe with anybody, because she was a very strong person and very safe person to be with indeed. So I remember that so clearly, going across the bay, being rowed across the bay by my friend's mother.
Well, something about your telling about it, Marge, is extra special to me because, of course, Marion took this for granted. I mean, she had lived on the island since she was 10 days old, and being there at the island was part of what she experienced growing up. So to hear about it through your eyes and through your experience helps the rest of us to realize maybe how amazing an experience it was. You said that Myrtle had some wisdom that she would share about the island or about the ocean or about the world in general.
Well, I think she was just so comfortable in the environment of Florida. She was so comfortable on the bay and so comfortable on the island. She was sort of one with it all. And I was very much aware of that as a little child. She was so knowledgeable about nature, and she would speak about it with such love and such tender sensitivity that, of course, it's a great life memory for me. It's a great part of my life and one of the great gifts of my life to have known her the way I did as a little girl, and even in awe of her a little bit as a child, because she was very special.
I do remember that myself because as my grandmother, I knew she was someone that when she spoke, I was to listen and do what she said the first time she said it. She was one of those type of people that just inspired you to know that you better listen the first time.
And you wanted to be on your good behavior with her. She was stern, she was very loving and very wonderful, very sweet, very understanding, but she expected good behavior, and she got it.
A good example.
A good example she was, indeed.
I wanted to ask you, what type of food did you take? What kind of provisions did you have?
Well, we have the boat loaded because we might go over for as long as a week or maybe even 2 weeks, I believe. At times we go with a loaded rowboat with, of course, dried things, cereals and fruit and things that would last for the 2 weeks, baked goods and all sorts of things. And she was a magnificent cook. And she did certain things that you picked things on the island that would be cookable. She knew what they were too. I can't even really call them now, but we'd have some greens of sorts. And then also the homestead, which was lived in at the time by a wonderful caretaker and his wife, had a vegetable garden. So we would go over and choose certain vegetables out of the garden and take them back to the cottages where we stayed on the beach. The beach faced Clearwater Beach, and there was Winkin, Blinken, and Nod cottages, which Mrs. Betts rented out. And we always stayed in the first cottage closest to Clearwater Beach called Winkin. And it was a darling cottage, and rainwater was collected for drinking and for bathing. That's where we would take our showers on the little back porch after coming in from a swim in the channel, which we were rushing water. We bob around out there in that channel. We would also bury ourselves in the sand, which was part of our activity. We did, of course, wonderful shelling. We had beautiful shell collections, rare shells that would wash up in those years we would find. It was a wonderful life. It really was.
You've made an important distinction because where you were staying with Marion and Myrtle was in one of the 3 cottages that had been built soon after Mr. Scherer had died. That would have been Marion's grandfather, the original homesteader on Caladesi. And you referenced the homestead, which the property where the cottages were built were part of the homestead, but they were facing what was then called Big Pass or Dunedin Pass. Right. The homestead area where you said Mr. Allison Broman and his wife Julia lived as caretakers to the homestead property. So you actually got to visit with Julia and Allison there at the homestead.
Oh my, yes. Oh yes, we would walk through the island. It was about a 45-minute walk to go from where we stayed in the cottages. We were in Winkin, as I said, and we would go through the island growth and undergrowth, and Mrs. Betts usually led Marion and me because she would know that there might be a snake in the way as we went, and she was fearless, so she just chased the snake away and we would continue our walk. It was about a 45-minute walk to go from the beach over to the homestead.
I think people will want to know, did you ever get to see a snake while you were at Caladesi?
Oh, probably, yes. Mostly scurrying off. I never got close to one, but there, of course, were snakes there. But it was a natural habitat for wildlife. Utterly magnificent, and still is.
Well,
it's protected.
I think that's significant for people to know that the snakes are there, but they're not coming out to greet you.
No.
They're trying to stay out of your way.
No, that's what we learned. Indeed we did.
I'm interested that you said you took most of your provisions and then other food you gathered or with Mrs. Betts is catching fish or getting from the homestead garden. So you sounds like you had some very good food.
Absolutely. And Mrs. Betts was a wonderful cook and an innovative
I can
cook.
attest to that.
And an innovative cook also. She would dream up things that might have grown on the island that she would stir up in a pot, and the next thing we knew we were having this wonderful lunch or dinner.
Well, you did a wonderful segue because, of course, recently my sister and I brought out the Caladesi cookbook because we wanted to do honor to Myrtle's talents as a cook.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that there was no electricity in those cottages. So what kind of stove were you cooking on? Do you remember?
Kerosene. A
Kerosene.
kerosene stove. We had light at nighttime with the kerosene lamps. And also one of the big problems of such living was the no-see-ums, which are just murderous little teensy tiny mosquito-like biting insects. And Myrtle would paint the screens of the cottages and where we were staying with kerosene so that they would not come in, and they didn't. That kept them out, and we had a comfortable evening. They would come in just at dusk, and they were big pests. They really, really were, but we knew how to deal with them because she knew how to deal with them.
I remember that too, growing up at my grandmother's home, and that it just was a fact of life,
It
and
really
you dealt
was.
with it, and you didn't give it any more
No.
importance than necessary because it was just an unpleasant but passing fact of life. Now, of course, Marge, when Myrtle was 87 and she wrote Yesteryear I Lived in Paradise, I remember meeting you. You came to the book signing party that was given for her when she was 90 years old on February 22nd, 1991, and you were there, and she was so pleased to see you. We actually have a photograph of you meeting her that day and how pleased she was to see you.
Well, I'll have to see that photograph because I was very pleased to see her.
I'll make sure.
We really kind of just, it was like a flashback into a really great history.
Well, we are so proud now to realize that Myrtle wrote this when she was 87. I think that the older I get, the more I realize that that was a very remarkable accomplishment, to take the time to write about your life and to save it then in a written form so that other people in the future can learn from it and share in it. Hope maybe you'll consider doing that with some of your memories.
Well, I don't know about that, but I would never be able to match this because it is a beautifully written book. She had a natural gift for writing. And actually, because she grew up on the island, she actually only went to school to the 3rd grade. But her father, Mr. Shearer, was a very well-educated man from Switzerland. And so he picked up on the education, and she became very well educated by her own father, living on the island. She had lost her mother early. I think she was 6 years old, am I right, when she lost her mother. She was very close to her father, and they were really quite a team living on the island. People would come over and visit the island from the Bellevue Biltmore Hotel when residents would come down from the north and take boats over to the island. Mr. Shearer was a great host to all of them, and they loved that island experience. But Mrs. Betts was a beautifully educated person thanks to her father, and wrote beautifully as evidence of this book. She had a way with words and could put them down to make a real beautiful story and a very readable one. Anything she wrote was always lovely.
It's just I think she was very fortunate to have such sweet friends as you to appreciate her. Now I want to have you tell us about your mother and father, because this would be a good time to have some record of that.
Well, I grew up in Dunedin, Florida. Dunedin was a little village of about 1,000 people. I believe when my English father came to America, he had heard about 2 places, Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, and also Mulberry, Florida, as places to visit. He got to Mulberry, Florida, and didn't think that was the best place for him, but he heard about Dunedin, which was even then a English and Scottish settlement. And his being English, he decided, I'll go look at that. Well, it was a given. One look at Dunedin, I thought, when he would tell me the story, he knew right away that it was his place to live, which he chose to live in Dunedin, which was where I grew up. I was born in Clearwater, grew up in Dunedin, and met Marion, of course, in the 2nd grade, and her wonderful mother in the second grade. So they're a life experience for me. Absolutely.
Well, I like the story of how your father met your mother. Will you tell that for us?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a little off track here, but yes, that was very dear. He built roads, and he was building a road in Seminole in front of a little cottage, which he became acquainted with the people who lived in the cottage. And that was Mr. and Mrs. Corman. And they invited him in to have lunch at lunchtime, just to kind of take a break from the work, and they had become friends. So he would go in and enjoy a marvelous Southern lunch, Southern cooked lunch. She was really a wonderful cook. And her little son, who was 8 years old at the time, was at the table when my dad said, and who became my dad, well, my father said first, if I could find somebody who cooked like this, I'd marry her. And the little boy at the table, 8 years old, said, well, then you should meet my Aunt Kate, because she can cook like this. And he met Kate, married Kate, and I can attest to the fact, being the daughter now of Kate and Harry Armston. She was a great cook.
He kept his word.
Oh, he certainly did.
He knew a jewel when he found her.
He knew she was a great cook, and she was.
Well, tell me about your mother's family. She was living in Seminole, or then it was called Cross Bayou?
It was called, yes, it was called Cross Bayou, just a little kind of crossroads going from Clearwater to St. Petersburg. It would take a long time to get to St. Petersburg in those days. But it was a charming little country town, literally a crossroads.
Well, your mother's family, did you know your grandparents on your mother's side?
I knew my grandmother. I have a vague memory of my grandfather. I think I was about 3 when I lost him. I was about 6 when I lost my grandmother, but I do have a vivid memory of her back to cooking. She made probably the best cake I've ever had in my whole life. I remember it quite clearly. Beautiful. Yes, I remember her.
That's lovely. So your mom had been born in Florida and was very acclimated as well to the Florida environment.
Yes. She was really considered a pioneer. Her family had come from St. Louis, Missouri, and Missouri Avenue is named for her family, who named. It was a road with a number on it in those years, and my great-grandmother said, well, you know, I come from St. Louis, Missouri, and we call our streets by name. So it was named Missouri Avenue by my great-grandmother.
Good for her. I like it. We wonder sometimes how these roads got their name, and there's a reason right there. Well, when you look around the Dunedin and Pinellas County of today, you've seen a lot of changes in your life, and you've lived through a time when there were groves and pastures and fields to roam in. I'm just wondering how you handled, you just stay so current and so involved. And
well, of course, it moves slowly, you know, so you sort of get used to the moment and the current era. But Dunedin was a tiny little town that was very sweet, and everybody knew everybody, very friendly, and I could walk all over town when I was 5 years old, be perfectly safe. My parents knew I was perfectly safe. They just say, watch carefully as you cross the street, and of course you may see a car every 20 minutes. In those days, that was really, you know, pretty small little town.
Ooh,
very small little town. Here comes a car. But at any rate, it was very safe. It was safe, or I wouldn't have been allowed to walk around town.
I think that's probably something that's very, I don't know, hard to imagine right now for people, that really there was a time and place where, I mean, you as young people were out on the water in boats all by yourselves, and going out to the island and spending the night.
Oh, yes. And actually, as I said a little bit ago, people would say, you mean to say your mother and dad will let you get in that boat with Mrs. Betts and row 3 miles across the bay with just her and your friend Marion in the boat? I said, well, yes. Again, I say, if I weren't safe with her, I wouldn't have been safe with anybody. She was it.
Do you remember Polly?
Polly the parrot.
Yes.
Of course. Polly was wonderful, talked with us, said fine things, and just, you know, always it was hello, but a very upbeat hello. Wonderful parrot. It was a Polly the parrot.
Well, she was my pet also when I was growing up.
She lived a long time.
She did. I have a great affection for Polly in my life. we could have given her maybe a more original name, but she was always Polly.
Oh, I think it was a good name for her.
I wanted to ask about other pets you might have had.
Well, always have been an animal lover. My mother liked cats, so consequently I always had a cat or two. Inside, maybe one or two outside. I love my cats, still do. Love cats from the childhood experience. Marion had the parrot, and I don't know, she had a dog, I believe. Didn't she have a dog?
I think there was always a dog at that would go back and forth sometimes to Caladesi.
Yes,
and,
yes.
Yeah.
And of course, then there were animals on the island, chickens and all kinds of, I don't know, wildlife that we were so accustomed to that we enjoyed very, very much. The experience of the wildlife of the island. Walking the beach with not a soul on it for 3 miles, an incredible experience. One of the great gifts of my life was being a friend of Marion and the family, and going to that island when it was totally private. Now, of course, it's a state park, thank goodness. I'm so glad it is, because it should be. But in those years, to have a private island in one's life, to go over there, it was truly a paradise. It was an incredible gift in my life to know and have that experience.
I'm so pleased that you did mention, yes, that now that Caladesi Island is a state park, it belongs to everyone in Florida.
That's right, and it should, because otherwise it would have been developed.
And how thankful we are,
Yes.
that citizens in the Dunedin area and all of Pinellas County got behind the idea of creating a state park at Caladesi Island. And we understand that it was Jerry Ram's leadership as first city commissioner and then mayor of Dunedin to kind of lead that effort and to help in the negotiations and the political will that it took to make that happen.
It took some doings, but thank goodness it has happened the way it has.
And that makes me want to ask you, do you happen to remember, or did you ever get to go up the fire tower?
I have to say no, I only know about it.
Right. So this fire tower was established or built on Caladesi as one of the first park destinations, and as an effort in 1967 when the park was first founded. So it was there until the 1980s, and it was wonderful to get up there, as you can imagine, and see a view all around the island.
I certainly can imagine.
The geography, to see all the way back to the mainland and see how the shape of the barrier island related to the mainland. And I believe you're very familiar with the idea that now we're going to build the Caladesi Discovery Center entirely on the existing footprint where the fire tower used to be, and we definitely want to make sure you get over and visit the Caladesi Discovery Center once it's built.
I'll look very much forward to that. I think it's going to be a beautiful addition. It's going to be nearby the ranger station, isn't it? So it's just kind of going to be in a niche that is still leaves the beauty of the island totally unspoiled. It has a spot that will be special for it and be part of the environment.
Thank you so much, Marge, because your support and your legacy at Caladesi really is appreciated by all of us who've been involved with the project, and your enthusiasm for it has helped to give us the energy to see this project through. And I know it's going to be a wonderful destination place, and it'll serve as an interpretive and educational center for visitors who come to Caladesi already, and now they will have that extra place to meet up and to learn about some of the wildlife and the habitat and the history, the history that you share with us, for instance.
And to be able to go up in that tower and look all around and see the bay and all around the island and far, far beyond. It'll be a 360-degree view from the top. It'll be remarkable.
Beautiful.
It really will be.
Thought. Thank you. Would there be anything else you'd like to share with us today? Because I just love to have this chance to talk with you, and I want to have this opportunity to make sure that you get to say something you'd like to.
Well, I think we've pretty much covered the territory, just in the fact that I think that the audience hearing will hear the love, certainly, that comes from my heart As I say, one of the great gifts of my life is having the experience of Caldici Island when I was a little girl growing up. One of the remarkable gifts of my life. And to know the granddaughter of Mrs. Betts is also one of the great gifts in my friendship with Marion, which is lifelong. Her mother, Terry's mother. So it's all such a big part of my life. It's as I say, one of the great gifts.
I thank you so much. I appreciate
you.
you.